All right, good morning. Last set of muscles that we're going to learn, and then after we're done with this, there's a couple biomechanical things I need to go over. Introducing you to different tools we use in biomechanics, like electromyography, motion capture, force plates, just some of that kind of lecture stuff. That's going to be not hard, I think. Just kind of some basic biomechanics to give you guys after that. So today we're going to get into our last group of muscles, the scapula influencing muscles. And before we go into the muscles, let me remind you guys of a little 310. So shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle obviously are different, not just with spelling, but conceptually, the right side of my pelvis and the left side of my pelvis are kind of tied together here at the sacroiliac joint. Full transparency, there is a little bit of play, but not a lot. That's why when people like have SI dysfunction, there's a little bit of play here, amphiarthritic, so just a little bit of play, but nothing significant. There's definitely no play like an oyster shell. We don't want the pelvis to move about the sacrum this way. So in other words, when we do right transverse, right lateral, left lateral, it's because we look at it like that because the whole pelvis has to move. Scapular, our shoulder girdle, are two independently moving hemispheres. So I can do right-sided stuff and the left doesn't have to go anywhere. I can do left-sided stuff and the right doesn't have to go anywhere. Okay? So pelvic girdle, not independent of side. Shoulder girdle, independent of side. Because unlike in the pubis, the pubic symphysis, where the articulation of the right and left hemispheres, we have this sternum that separates, so they're independent of each other. So if you remember from 310, the shoulder girdle proper is made up of four main articulations. You have your sternoclavicular joint, that's right here. Technically, this is where your upper extremity attaches to your thorax. It's right here. Okay. So where your collarbone hits your sternum, so like if you do an elevation and depression, you can kind of see it do this, and it actually rotates a little bit. Sternoclavicular. Follow the clavicle down, and then you get to the acromioclavicular. Now, the acromion is just a part of scapula. It's just a part of South Louisiana, is part of Louisiana, even though it's, or I can't, better word than that is Acadiana, is an area of Louisiana, but it's still part of Louisiana. The acromion is an area of the scapula, but it's still scapula. Now, when you have a bone, that especially long bones that have a lot of different articulations, it gets confusing if we use the same thing multiple times. So in other words, why do we say glenohumeral joint? Why not scapulohumeral joint? Because we would use scapula a lot. Clavicula, scapula, humeral scapula, scapula thorax. Does that make sense? So that's why we kind of go with the landmarks when the bone itself, we only like to kind of use it once so that it doesn't get ultra confusing. So the acromioclavicular joint, sometimes in sports, when you have a collision, you might have an AC sprain, if anybody's ever heard that term before. So this is where the collarbone is kind of allowed to rotate about the acromion, because when you have these kind of motions of upward rotation of the scapula, this kind of needs to play a little bit in its transverse plane. That's all it is. Sternoclavicular, acromioclavicular, glenohumeral. That was our shoulder joint. Flexion, extension, abduction. Remember, one of the questions on 310 was, this is not shoulder shrugs, right? That's scapular stuff. That's what we're going to get into, those specific muscles. Because the shoulder joint is just going along for the ride. This is just as arbitrary elbow shrugs or wrist shrugs. I mean, it's just going along with the elevator, right? Elevator, elevation. So that brings us to the star of the show, and that is the fourth articulation of the shoulder girdle, and that's the scapula-thoracic articulation. Notice I didn't say joint. It's like apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Which one doesn't belong? Sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, glenohumeral joint, scapula-thoracic articulation. So the scapula sits on the thorax, but it's technically an articulation of bones, ribs, and scapula. But it's not the same type of articulation like a synovial joint articulation, where there's a water balloon and a joint capsule. The scapula sits on the thorax and kind of floats back here and orbits the ribs. That's how I kind of try to look at it. I kind of think of the heart as the sun, and the scapula is going to kind of orbit the rib cage. And the scapula, because it's not a traditional synovial joint, and we have muscles that fit in between the scapula and the ribs that we're going to learn. One of them you're already familiar with, the subscapularis. So I like to think of it as like a sandwich, a Sammy. So you got bread on top, and you got bread, ribs on the bottom, and then you got some deli meat that lives in between the two that we're going to learn. But the scapula sits on the thorax, and it's held together by muscles that we're going to learn. So you have muscular stabilization of the scapula. For those of you that work in rehab clinics, you do some scapula muscle exercises to try to help. And it's also held together by our good friend negative pressure, suction cup mechanism. So you have interthecal, intrapleural is a word that I forget. But basically, it's negative pressure. It's like, have you ever heard of someone like that might have a puncture wound and there's a pressure gradient, like they'll call it like pneumothorax and that kind of stuff. It's like popping the suction cup, and you lose that pressure gradient. So there's negative pressure in here that kind of helps the scapula sit on the thorax as well. It's kind of cool. But we all have that one friend at a party or social gathering who can do that trick where they put their arm back there and make their scapula wing out. Y'all know what I'm talking about? A wing and scapula. Right? So that's an example of how you don't wing your elbow joint. Right? I mean, someone might be hypermobile, but the scapula, that kind of shows how the scapula is just kind of floating back there. The fact that you can kind of put some extra deli meat between those two pieces of bread. Now, I'm going to say, is that a good thing, a bad thing? Where if you don't have any problems, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's when you have problems. And one of the things we're going to learn, this is going to be cool, we're going to learn which muscles specifically help to maintain scapula-thoracic articulation, so that when you're doing those rehab exercises, you know exactly which ones to target to help keep that scapula orbiting the correct way around the thorax. So, another thing I want to point out, for a muscle to cross a joint, it has to cross the joint. And then its specific function is, how does it cross? If I'm laying down on a table, or if Grace is laying down on the table, and I pull her arm down, so like I'm doing traction on her. I'm pulling on her hand is connected to her forearm is connected to her upper arm. And the humerus is obviously connected to the scapula. So if I pull down on the arm, the humerus is going to pull the scapula in a direction of depression. So what I'm trying to say is, you do have muscles that cross into your shoulder joint that can pull on the shoulder and thus pull on the scapula while it travels. No different than an extensor big toe pulls at the ankle because it crosses the ankle to get there. So you will, in graduate school, the pectoralis major to get to the humerus is pulling on the humerus, and then it can also pull on the scapula. The latissimus dorsi pulling on the humerus can also pull on the scapula. So it makes sense that, like, if you're doing dips, it's like, how in the world are just these little scapular muscles doing scapular motion? You do have muscles that cross the scapula cross the shoulder, pull on the humerus, and thus can pull on the scapula. That's graduate school stuff. For this test, I'm just giving you the muscles that are directly tugging on the scapula. The muscles that are directly influencing scapular motion, like directly pulling on the scapula itself. Okay. Make sense? All right. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. The whole diatribe of me reminding you about the scapulothoracic articulation is the reason we view the scapular muscles in a different plane, because it's not a traditional joint. The main muscles that are tugging on the scapula are pulling on the scapula to influence its scapulothoracic movement on the thorax. So it's easiest to see them from a frontal view. So every view up until this point has been a cross section, but this doesn't have a joint after its name. This is not a traditional synovial joint. So that's why we're going to literally view it from the posterior. And this will all make sense, hopefully. But if I have muscles that are more on the medial side of my scapula, those are going to be retraction pullers. So trying to pull the scapula to the spine. So the muscles that are going to be on the left side are going to be my retraction pull. This is a posterior view. The muscles that are on the inside, closer to the spine, are going to be trying to pull my scapula back to my spine. Does that first part make sense? Those are going to be the muscles here. Pulling this. Okay. Well, if here's my border, it's not necessarily an axis. My triangle is representing my scapula here. So the medial, the more inside crossing muscles are going to be my retractors. So it makes sense that my lateral crossing muscles on the other side are going to be my protraction pullers. I'm going to show you how all these work, but we've been on a roll of seeing circles transversely. This is the only one that's frontally. And this is only if you do circles. Because it's a lot easier. Go ahead.
So, all 5 of the left side are retracted, or just the 3 of the center?
So I'm going to teach you how the trapezius is a fan-shaped muscle. So this is one muscle, just like your deltoid. So we're going to have different fibers that can do different things, but all of them collectively do this and try to do this. I'm going to teach you how that works, but this is one muscle that has different fibers. Retraction pullers, protraction pullers, elevation pullers, depression pullers. This is actually the one that's traditional with an axis. Upward rotation pullers and downward rotation. Elevators, thrusters, retractors, protractors. Think of it. A protraction puller is going to try to make the scapula go further away from the spine. If you think about it. Retractors are trying to bring the scapula closer to the spine. Protractors are trying to bring the scapula further away from the spine. And then we're going to have upward and downward rotation pulls. And this is actually why I had to do this, because the upward and downward rotation is actually the only thing that has rotation by its name, because it's more of a traditional, there's an axis and and that axis is an anterior posterior axis. So that would be really tough to see. Thought Halloween was over. That would be very tough to see in a transverse view. Again, we're going to go through all the muscles, and I'm going to teach you, especially the trapezius, man. The trapezius is so cool. But I just wanted to break down the layout of the circle, of the cross-sectional view of the muscles based off of how they cross from a different view of it, because it's not a traditional joint. It's not like a wrist, an elbow, a shoulder. This is an articulation of a scapula floating around the thorax, and the easiest way to see the muscles is from a posterior view, a frontal plane view. These would be really hard to see from a cross-section. This is not a traditional. You're kind of looking at those muscles collectively that we're going to talk about. I think serratus anterior and trapezius are my favorite. Those are so cool. This is a reminder of the motions, right? Elevation, so we have to have elevation pullers. Depression, so we have to have depression pullers. We call this retraction, potato. And we call this protraction, we call this upward rotation and downward rotation. So we're going to have elevation pullers, elevators, pressors, retractors, protractors, upward rotators, and downward rotators. What I love, I know this is semantics, and someone just did this as a cartoon illustration, but I love, like, muscular-wise, like, muscles can only pull, right? So we can't have things that are like pushing on the scapula to make it go up, right? We have to pull, just like an elevator cable has to pull. Nothing's pushing the elevator up. So this one kind of fits, right? Yanking it down. Like this was the same thing. Like we don't have muscles that push your scapula. It always just kind of cracks me up. We don't have muscles that are pushing it out. It's just a show of direction and motion. This one's accurate. We have muscles that pull. All right, let's do I'm going to do the trapezius first, just because I want to start off with banging. I just think this is just so cool. We close it. Guys, when I was your age, I couldn't wait to learn how this muscle worked, because like I'd seen it in books and bro science magazines, but it made no sense to me because it was like all over the place. Like, wait, how can one muscle have a top, a bottom, a left, a right? Make up your mind, you know? Like it was just one of those kind of things. But I'm also Hufflepuff, so yeah. Has anybody ever also had like consideration of this muscle? Like, how in the world does this work? Like, you could see a bicep, right? You see the string pulling, but like this thing was just like. So the trapezius, somewhat triangular shape, trapezoid, but look at all that coverage area. And remember what I told you guys about fan-shaped muscles, and that's what it is. It's a fan-shaped muscle. But fan-shaped muscles have every fiber of that muscle has to have something in common. Because if it didn't have something in common, it wouldn't be the same muscle. But it doesn't have to have everything in common. The trapezius, believe it or not, I'm going to teach you how this works, has two functions that all the fibers do together. That's kind of cool. One of them I think is kind of obvious to see. The retraction pull, right? All of those fibers are trying to bring the scapula closer to the spine, whether it's the lower part or the upper part or the middle part. Can you see how all those fibers are trying to bring the scapula to the spine? So I think the retraction pull should be pretty easy to see. That the whole trapezius. So remember our precedent with verbiage. When I say biceps femoris and I just leave it at that, that infers both heads. When I say trapezius and I leave it at that, that infers all the five. When I say deltoid, I'm working my right and left deltoids, plural. It means all the fibers. When I'm just working anterior, I'm going to say anterior. Just working posterior, I'm going to say posterior. I don't have to say anterior, middle, and posterior deltoids. If I'm working all of them, I'm going to say deltoid. Okay. The second easiest thing to see, the upper fibers are trying to pull me in and up. So the upper fibers are going to have elevation pull to them. Make sense? Like the elevator cable pulling up. And the lower fibers are going to have depression pull to them. And when you're using them all together, cool, they cancel out. Retraction pull. We are going to separate the fibers, just like we did with the deltoid or the gluteus medius and minimus. But instead of anterior, posterior, instead of anterior, this is a different view. It's not sitting like our other joints. So we're just going to use layman's terms, upper and lower. There's some middle stuff happening too, but if you think about it, the one that's across isn't going to pull me up or down. Does that make sense? So if it has a vertical pull, it's going to have an elevation pull to it, and if it has a downward pull, it's going to have a depression pull to it. Now the fun part. Okay. Imagine. Let's use our imagination. And I'm going to take this structure that we call the spine of the scapula. Okay. And I'm going to expand it out. I'm going to click and blow it up. And the spine of the scapula is going to be this PVC pipe for this example. Now, just because I took the spine out doesn't mean the rest of the scapula doesn't exist. You just have to imagine it here. But if this is the right scapula, we know that upward rotation is this and downward rotation is that. If we're just looking at the spine. Upward, downward. Cool? Okay. Another thing we know is that there is a physics concept called a force couple that I might have introduced you guys earlier. But all a force couple is, if we had a merry-go-round, a recess, all a force couple is an efficient way of spinning something. Two different directional linear forces. This was going to the right, that one's going to the left. That are working together to try to spin something in the same direction. So think about it. If you were the adults outside for recess and kids wanted to spin the merry-go-round, no offense to any one of you, but they're going to spin faster if there were two adults spinning the merry-go-round. And the two adults get on the same side. The two adults are going to get on opposite sides. And one is going to pull to your right, and the other one on the other side is going to pull to your left. Two different linear pulls, but they both have the same rotational influence. Does that make sense? That's what a force couple is. So let me show you how the trapezius uses a force couple to not spin a merry-go-round, but to spin your scapula. Here's your spine. You have upper fibers that are pulling the lateral part of the spine this way and making the scapula want to spin as you see it. Let's see, that would be counterclockwise, right? You have the middle fibers coming on the spine and also trying to spin it counterclockwise. So it's like having two people spinning merry-go-round, one right here. And then the lower fibers on this end of the teeter-totter is trying to spin the scapula the exact same rotational way. All of the fibers, the upper rotators, and I'm sorry, not they're all upper rotators. The upper, the middle, and the lower are all trying to spin the merry-go-round in the same rotational direction, even though they have different linear. It's like if I were trying to stay, spine of the scapula. If I was trying to spin the chair and I only used one force, like one, I would make I'd make the chair spin, but I would also kind of translate it as it spun, general motion. But if I just wanted to torque the chair and just spin it and not have it go anywhere, I want to use a force couple. I want to push-pull. I want to pull. Obviously, muscles can't push, but I want to have two different pulls that is going to help me be more efficient to spin. Have you ever noticed when you do, if anybody's ever done like upright row exercises, and we think about like it being shoulder stuff, and I'm not disrespecting the shoulder component, but you know, after you do a set, you feel it in your traps, because the component of those traps upwardly rotating that scapula as your arms come up. And then the elevation pull, right? So you have your upper traps working two jobs, elevation and upper rotation pull. That's why, like, after you do the upright row, you're like, God, I feel it in my traps. Because, yeah, dude, the traps are working.
So is that the second thing that all firms do together is crouch on the chair?
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me. Sometimes I go on detours. But we'll get there eventually. Thanks to you. But no, you know what's cool though is that you were thinking logically. You're like, oh, all the fibers are trying to spin. Even though this one's pulling down and those are pulling up, they have the same spin pull. Does that make sense? Now that is tough to try to communicate on a two-dimensional picture. And these are all, guys, I didn't get any of these circles. I didn't get that from a textbook. I created these because that's how my brain sees things. You don't have to see it the way I see it. But what I'm saying is that sometimes it's hard to try to describe these kind of exceptionary things. So that's why I used, after years of feedback, that's why I used this approach. So what I'm trying to convey is everything in the circle, in the red circle, what red oval, is one muscle. It's one muscle. All of those fibers pull like this, and all of those fibers are do this. Does that make sense?
But the arrows indicate.
Yes, the force couple. Yes, the arrows are trying to indicate the force couple. I'm accentuating it, obviously, because the lower traps aren't necessarily pulling lateral, but I'm trying to emphasize that these are two different linear facing muscles, but they're trying to create the same spin. So if like this was connected to here, both of those muscles would be trying to pull in the direction of upward rotation.
But if it was a trick question on the test.
I don't ask trick questions.
Right.
Continue.
Like, the middle one really isn't pulling, like, the two that are the first couple are
The major ones. Now there is some semantics in here that will not be on your test, okay? So what I mean by that is, how many colors do we have? It's kind of a trick question, right? Because like I grew up with an 8-set Crayola, but according to my wife, there's like 45 different shades of red. That's cool. I just know red. I don't know candy apple red. I don't know, right? So there is kind of this little spectrum, and I'm just telling you this for your knowledge. What is the transition between an upper and a lower? So it's like you have these obvious uppers, and then less and less upper, but it still has an upward pull, and then it's like there's like a little bit of fiber, like right in the middle, right? That's like right there on the axis. But it's almost kind of like when we're doing the radial ulnar joint motion. It's like pronators, but then there's like 1 degree where there's nothing, and all of a sudden supinators. So there is like, but everything on top of it technically is upper, and everything on the bottom is lower. So they do have a little bit that's right on the axis, right on the upward and downward rotational axis. But it's too insignificant for me to give it like its own cred. Does that make sense? It's a great question. So the reason it's such a good question is because you want to know, like, hey, would I? And no, all I'm going to ask you is that all of the fibers are retraction pullers, and all of the fibers, not a majority of the fibers are upward rotation pullers, and it's just the one that isn't. It's like so insignificant. Make sense? It's good stuff. Good stuff. And what's really neat too is that, like, if you have, let's say we have a fiber that happens to be right on the axis, as soon as you start to upwardly rotate, now all of a sudden that thing actually crosses the axis. So that's why for our purposes of this class, a vast majority of the fibers are going to be upper rotation pullers. So that's why we do it. Such a great question. So what did we learn? We learned that our first muscle, which I think the serratus anterior might be difficult to, not for us, we're going to work through it. But the trapezius, retraction pullers, upward rotation pullers, and then that's why, like, God, I hate silly analogies, but when our forefathers were designing the government, and they were like, well, every state should kind of count as the same, and they're like, well, wait, we have twice the population as you, so they compromised. They were like, what if we have a House of Representatives that's based off of population, but then we have a Senate where all states have equal share? It's very similar, where I'm having my cake and eating it too. I'm showing you the trapezius is one muscle with the red oval, but then I'm showing you the separate functions of the top and the bottom. Does that make sense? The upper part are the elevation pullers, the downward parts, the depression pullers, and like literally that square is like 3 little fibers that happen to be right on the axis. Upper fibers, lower fibers, one muscle. Let's do my second favorite muscle of the scapula, the infamous serratus anterior. Has anybody ever heard of the serratus anterior? No? No shot. Serratus anterior gets its name because like it's serrated. So you think about like a serrated blade. You know, they have like little serrations. So you kind of think of how the ribs are set up. You have these serrations on the ribs. And it has an anterior pull. So that's how it got its name, the serratedness of the looping muscles. These are the muscles you see on someone who shrink wrapped their skin and lost a ton of body fat, and you see those like finger-like projections on the side of the ribs. I would show you, but it's not ethical. But I mean, you could totally see mine if I had a sharp. Guys, I'm joking, man. Lighten up, Francis. I don't believe what I say, guys. I'm joking. So serratus anterior, this is where it gets a little weird. The muscles start on the ribs, but they go in between the bread, belly meat. So in other words, they come from the ribs, they pass in between the scapula and the ribs, and they insert, and I'm going to pass this around because I think it's important. I'll show you on the diagram, but there's on the scapula, on the inside of the scapula, this blue border. And that's what the serratus anterior is literally yanking on the scapula. This blue border on the inside. So in other words, it passes in between the ribs. Oh, this is anchored down so you can't see it. But that blue border is literally that muscle pulling that anterior draw on the scapula. So I think the contraction pull should be easy to see. Okay? So for those of you at home, you see that blue border? Comme ça right there. So it's going in between the ribs and the scapula, pulling on the, now this is the vertebral border, but because that muscle crosses anterior to posterior, it's pulling, it's having an anterior draw, it's having an anterior pull. In other words, if it came from the back, it'd have a retraction pull, but it came from the front. So it's pulling the medial part of the scapula anterior. Find a better view of the serratus anterior. Love this muscle. So cool. There we go. So what I love about this picture that's in your PDF is it disappears because it's going on the inside of the scapula, but it's still showing you where it's pulling in. The dotted line is its insertion, pulling the scapula in a direction of protraction. That's the first one. All right. Here we go. The second function of the serratus anterior is an upward rotation pull. That's another good view of them taking the scapula and kind of floating it and showing you where those serrated muscles are going to. Now, this is, I think, a better view. It's hard to see what I'm about to show you from this view, but I think this is a much better view. So let me identify a few landmarks, right? So that's where your shoulder, that's your socket for your shoulder. That's your coracoid process. We're going to come back to that. Well, we have coracobrachialis, your bicep short head attaches there. Just a big bony prominence that helps anterior pulling muscles pull on a bone that's in your back. It's an extension, like almost reaching a hand over and say, hey, it's going to make it easier for you to pull forward with this bony prominence, this little peninsula that jets out forward. What do you think that is? So that's our acromion, which connects to our spine. So here's our representation of our spine. If you have a muscle that starts on the ribs, goes out to the scapula, nothing super expensive props in this class. Spine is up here. So the serratus anterior is going through, attaching on the vertebral border and pulling in a direction of upward rotation. because upward and downward rotation of the scapula, the axis isn't in the middle of the bone. It's actually at the spine. Let me give you a different analogy. I wish I had Kindle with me, but I think this analogy will work. If you had imagine there was like a Western movie and the good guy was riding on the horse and he lassoed the bad guy and the lasso falls down to the feet and he pulls the bad guy. And if I pulled at the feet, it's going to make the person rotate over. Okay. So the first way I want you to think of this is the obvious fibers. So if this was a lasso pulling here's the feet, here's the trunks. The bottom part makes it easier to see right away. That if I'm pulling on the blue border at the bottom, doesn't it make sense that I'm going to pull in a direction of upward rotation? If I'm pulling at the bottom, I first want to see the obvious. And from a torque standpoint, the lower I pull from the axis, the greater the rotation. The axis of rotation for scapular upward downward rotation is up here at the spine. That's actually where the axis is. You're not spinning like, literally the axis is up here. So my point is that anything under the spine, even though these fibers, even though the fibers kind of closer to the axis aren't going to be as efficient, all of the fibers, majority of the fibers are underneath where the axis of rotation is, so therefore they're going to be pulling in the direction of upward rotation. This is also a force coupling. Meaning, you have the upper trap pulling this way on the spine, the lower trap pulling this way, and then you have your serratus anterior yanking the scapula anterior. Let's try to look at it a few different ways. And then we'll go to our video. So serratus anterior from a different angle. I love this one because it makes the scapula transparent or translucent so you can see the deli meat in between the two pieces of bread. Does that make sense? Look, guys, here's our spine. Look how high that is. So the protraction pull should be obvious, but the upward rotation pull, again, it's harder to see the fibers that are closer to the spine. I'll give you that. So just look at the ones that are super obvious. Just kind of work your way up and saying, well, if there's my axis, this one's trying to rotate the person, this one's trying to rotate the person, this one's trying to rotate, and I know that it gets less and less efficient as we go up to it, but it's still trying to tip the person over like this, or upward rotation. Your serratus anterior is the most important muscle to maintain scapulothoracic rhythm or connection. That's not negative pressure. So in other words, your serratus anterior, the protraction pull of it, is the most muscle to keep your scapula up against your thorax. So when people have winging and stuff and their scapula is kind of not floating back there, that's why they're typically do protraction exercises. But another fun fact too, and the reason I started off with serratus anterior and trapezius is it makes sense that your dominant arm, whatever arm you're dominant with, will have naturally more innervation of scapular muscles. Like if you're right-handed, or in my case, I'm left-handed. So my serratus anterior is more developed on my left side because I've innervated those scapular muscles doing more things left-handed than right-handed. Should I save this for next class? When we're spinning the merry-go-round, Kids just want to go around the merry-go-round. They don't care who is doing more of it. They just want to have fun. They just want to spin. So if what I taught you, your trapezius, all of your fibers in your serratus anterior are your main upward rotation pullers. And when you're doing bilateral exercises, you learn to make sure that the left and the right go up at the same time, or else you're good with this kind of stuff. When I was first bench pressing, when I was in football and I was in junior high, I remember when I first learned to bench, like my left side would go up higher than my right side because I was like a fiddler crab, like I did everything with my left hand. So my left arm was more developed. And then you learn how to be symmetrical. Here's what I'm trying to tell you. It's common for people's arm dominance to show with muscular development. I can look at someone, left-handers are about 10% of the population. So it's like finding four-leaf clovers for me. But I can look at someone, and if their left shoulder looks more depressed than their right, they're left-handed. The reason is because their serratus anterior of their dominant arm is more developed than the non-dominant. So if your serratus anterior of your non-dominant is less developed, guess what muscles have to compensate when you're doing overhead stuff? Your trapezius. So your non-dominant trap tends to be bigger and more developed, and you can see it in terms of looking at people's. So it looks like their shoulder is higher than the other, but it's actually trap developed. Because if I'm going to rotate my scapula, I don't care who did it. I just need to make sure I have enough force to make a move bilateral. And if my serratus anterior can't contribute to that groove as much, then the trap will say, I got your back, dude. And I'll contribute more to make sure that the left and the right are the same. As future therapists, we just need to be aware. I'm not saying we got to fix people on this test. Of course not. I'm not here to teach you therapy. But awareness that when you have different muscles that are working in these forced couples, and one of them, I guess it's kind of like link tension stuff. If one of them isn't contributing as much, someone's got to take up that slot. It's kind of cool. That was a lot of talk for two muscles, huh? Well, that's what I like about taking our time. Any questions? So the function of your trapezius holistically, retractor, upward rotator. Upper fiber is going to be elevation pullers. Lower fiber is going to be depression foot pullers. We're just going to forget about those little bitty fibers in the middle for this test. Your serratus anterior, protractor, and upward rotator of the scalp. Go. Go stay warm.